Welcome to the 11th episode of the ongoing series, The 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness here on Svarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. In this episode of the series, we discuss Rabbi Menashe ben Israel and his work Mikve Yisrael, or The Hope of Israel, or Esperanza de Israel. And this work is something that came up in previous episodes when discussing Antonio de Montezinos on episodes 9 and 10 of the series and his Relacion. This is something that's relayed in the beginning of Mikve Yisrael. And this talks about, in general, about the Aseret Shvatim, especially about the New World and the Americas and the Native Americans, and it's quite an interesting work. And we discussed Menashe himself and the work a little bit, and there's obviously much more to discuss. As mentioned on the episode, but I'll mention here, there will be a link in the show's notes where you can check out the English edition through Lippmann, and as well as you can check out, there's been Hebrew translation, older Hebrew translation. It's on Hebrew books, but there's also available to print out on Amazon, and I'll put a link in that in the show's notes. I do want to mention on Menashe that I mentioned this on other episodes of the podcast, that in Nishmas Chaim, Menashe's sefer is only sefer that he wrote in Hebrew about the neshama. So first of all, there is an academic English edition that's forthcoming. But aside from that, there is interest. I would like to, and with some others, with my friend Moshe Maimon, perhaps do a new edition in Hebrew and do it justice. So for anyone interested in partaking in that project, or if you're anyone's interested or know someone interested in substantially providing money for such a project, you can please reach out to me at svarimchatter@gmail.com or message me on the WhatsApp chat. And the series now will run on Wednesdays, as previous series have, for the next couple of weeks until the series ends. The corporate sponsor of this series, as always, Gluck Plumbing, for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full service division from boiler replacements, main sewer line snakeouts, cammering main lines to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. And of course, if you do, please tell them that you heard them on the podcast and thank them for their continued support of the podcast. If you'd like to sponsor an individual episode for this series, please email me svarimchatter@gmail.com, or to support any episode or just to support the podcast, even a small amount, you can check out the links and information in the show's notes below, or email me or message me on WhatsApp if you're on the chat. Also, please subscribe to the WhatsApp community chat where I post news, Svarim, books, and that sort of thing. Also, there's the Svarim Chatter Substack and the Svarim Chatter YouTube channel. All that stuff and information is in the show's notes below. And finally, if you can please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen to the podcast, whether 24/6, Apple, Spotify, and so on. And please enjoy this episode of the series. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode in the ongoing series of the Lost Tribes in Jewish Consciousness. On this episode of the podcast, in this series, I'm going to be joined by Professor Sina Rauschenbach, who is professor at the University of Potsdam for Religious Studies and Jewish Thought in the Department of Jewish Studies and Religious Studies at the University of Potsdam. And she's also the author of the book, I'll read the English title, which is Judaism for Christians, Menashe ben Yisrael, 1604 to 1657. And we'll be discussing Menashe, and particularly as it pertains to his book, Mikve Yisrael, The Hope of Israel, numerous translations, we'll get into that. And in particular, as relates to the book, listeners are familiar with previous episodes in this series with Professor Ronnie Perelis and Professor Jonathan Schorch about Antonio de Montezinos, Aaron Halevi, and his Relacion, which is the first thing included in this work by Menashe. So we'll make mention of it, but it's not going to be the focal point of this episode. So thank you, Professor Rauschenbach, for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So let's start off, if you could tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I was born and raised in Western Berlin during the last decades of the Berlin Wall, actually, and studied mathematics and philosophy. So I came from a quite different field, and decided to do my PhD in philosophy with a focus on medieval Iberian Jewish thought, in particular about Yosef Albo and the Sefer Ikarim, and continued afterwards with my second book into the history of the Sephardic Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam and the work of Menashe ben Israel. So I finished my Habilitation, which is the German second book title. In between, I was invited to work and research at a variety of different universities and institutions, among them the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin, the Herzog August Bibliothek in Wolfenbüttel, and the Berlin Institute for Advanced Studies, the Wissenschaftskolleg. And then in 2014, I earned my position in religious studies and Jewish thought at the Department of Jewish Studies and Religious Studies in Potsdam in the region of Brandenburg. So I returned to Berlin and work now in the field of early modern Sephardic history and thought, with a special interest in the Atlantic world, in the colonial Americas. And one of my aims, obviously, is to strengthen Sephardic studies in Germany, which are not anymore present after the Shoah and the end of the Wissenschaft des Judentums, and to draw the attention of my students also to Jewish worlds beyond Ashkenaz. So I've been at the head of a research focus titled Sephardic Perspectives at the Selma Stern Center for Jewish Studies, Berlin-Brandenburg, during the years of 2014 and 2022. And I try to continue working on everything that's connected to Iberian Jews on the Iberian Peninsula and in their diasporas. Let's say it like this.
So interesting. So you're in Ashkenaz, you're in Germany, but you're focusing on Sfarad and Spain. It's interesting. So, as you say, you started off in philosophy in University of Albo in the 14th century, and suddenly you moved on, you jumped to Amsterdam in the early modern period in the community, the Sephardic community of Amsterdam, and Menashe ben Yisrael specifically, and you wrote a whole book on Menashe ben Yisrael. How did that happen? How did you go from one time period and place to the other?
Well, some of the connections also natural, because of following the Iberian Jews after their expulsion and their forced conversion in the end of the 15th century, you forcibly end up in Amsterdam if you turn west, let's say it like that, and don't go to the Mediterranean. But actually, I first came across Menashe in the Menashe. I was switched between Menashe and Menashe in the writings of Christian scholars, Christian Hebraists, whom I studied during my research on Albo, because I had a large part of my book on Albo is about the Christian reception of Albo and the readings and misreadings of Albo, due to the compromises he had to do in the context of forced disputations and the conversions. And so many of the readers actually of Albo that I studied quote Menashe. So at a certain point, I became interested in him because he was obviously the second most important person in all these books. And I started to read about Menashe, and then I discovered that he published several of his works in Spanish and in Latin. And I became highly interested because this was also the connection between the Christian scholarly world I was interested in. I was in history then, in the Department of General History, so-called general history. I'm not so happy with this division between Jewish and general. And I was always very close to Iberian worlds. Also in my personal life, I had a very close relation with Spain and Spanish friends. So this seemed to be like a perfect fit. And I wondered how Menashe moved between his scholarly and his political engagement. At this point, I was interested in, we were with a group of colleagues, we were working on a project on public intellectuals and ways how to translate this concept, which is profoundly modern, into early modern times. So what is a public intellectual in the 17th and the 16th century? And Menashe seemed to be a wonderful person to study this connection because he's not always taken so serious as a scholar. People tend to say that he is not one of the most important halachic authorities or anything, but he has a strong impact on the society and the life. So this is exactly how to approach him through this combination through the politics of his scholarly work and the combination how to turn engagement in the Republic of Letters into political engagement.
Yeah, he was a really unique and interesting figure. And as you say, we'll go to Menashe. He was really, in the fascinating part was, as you say, he wrote Svarim. You can still go into Svarim stores today, I think, and still find Nishmas Chaim about the Neshama, but he has a lot of things that he wrote in other languages, Spanish and Portuguese and Latin and English, and not necessarily Svarim, so to speak. So you say he's not so famous. I think I heard a podcast, I was not familiar with him. Listeners maybe are Rabbi Dr. David Katz, who has a history podcast in Baltimore, and he did a Menashe. I think he compared him to like, just, I don't know if this is a perfect analogy, but his analogy was to like Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, as someone who's in contact with all of the non-Jews as of his day and as a big philosopher, as opposed to just only being in contact with the Jews. Not as a perfect analogy, but I remember he had a bio. It just was interesting to hear kind of, just again, not everything's perfect analogy, but it's an interesting analogy, an interesting one. And as you say, Menashe isn't necessarily so famous today. So I did a bio on Menashe a couple of years ago with Professor Stephen Nadler, who published a recent biography of Menashe in the Yale, I think, the Jewish Lives series. So listeners can listen to that, but the one I mentioned with Rabbi Dr. David Katz. But I also, let's ask you, although we are going to focus here on the Mikve Yisrael, and it was really fascinating work and really interesting and a little bit wild and wacky maybe, for those that read it now. But let's first start with Menashe's basic bio, just his basic background and upbringing and his basic biography.
Just very briefly. So Menashe was born into a Portuguese family of converso background in 1604. And converso background, just for those who are not familiar with the term, means that their ancestors had once been Jews and had been converted or chosen to convert to Christianity during the pogroms of 1391 or the expulsion edicts of Castile and Aragon in 1492, or the first conversions of 1497 in Portugal. So among these conversos were many who became true Christian in quotation marks and gave up or forgot about their Jewish background, and others who kept to their Jewish family background, continued to be observant Jews as much as they could, persecuted by the Inquisition. So obviously parts of the family of Menashe belonged to the second group. They were crypto Jews, secret Jews. And among some of the family members, Menashe's father and his first wife had been persecuted by the Inquisition, and they had been reconciled. This is an Inquisition term, by the Inquisition. So they had been accused, found guilty of Judaism, and had been reconciled, in quotation marks. We have to be very careful with these Inquisition terms. It's difficult because this is only audio, so I would like to mark the quotation marks with my hands, but it is not visible. So they've been reconciled by the Inquisition and reintegrated into the Catholic Church. But still, there was always a high danger, because usually people, or not usually, it was like a law that the second time people were accused of Judaizing, this is also an Inquisition term, there was not anymore any pardon, and they would usually be handed over to the secular authorities and burned at the stake. So the family, there was an urgency to leave the Iberian Peninsula, obviously. And around the turn of the century, Menashe's father, his second wife, and their children, one daughter and two sons, left Portugal, first to Madeira, then to La Rochelle, and then to Amsterdam. They arrived around 1613-14 in Amsterdam and became members of the recently founded Sephardic Portuguese community there, where they turned into what Joseph Kaplan has called new Jews. So they changed their names and they became Jews. This is a very nice analogy that Joseph Kaplan has used from New Christians, which was the terminology of the Iberian so-called old Christians, to distinguish themselves from everybody who had a Jewish or also Muslim ancestry. And so those who grew up as Christians and turned into Jews were called New Jews by Kaplan. One is New Christians is a historical term, New Jews is a research term. So I'm not sure how much to say about 17th century Amsterdam if you had Stephen Nadler, but Amsterdam was just very briefly, a very special place for Jews in the 17th century. It the Netherlands had been Spanish, so there had been no open Jewish lives. But after the rebellion of the Dutch of the northern provinces against the Spaniards and the Declaration of Independence in the end of the 16th century, so in the Union of Utrecht in 1578, the northern provinces had declared that they approve of liberty of conscience, which was not the same thing as the public how do you say, the public performance of religion, but still people could not be persecuted for what they believed. And as far as the Jews were concerned, things seemed to be much easier than for Catholics and Lutherans, for example, which is quite paradoxical for the 17th century Europe. Usually Amsterdam was probably the only place in Europe where Jews were in a better condition than Catholics or Lutherans. So a Jewish community was established, and which became very important, and obviously in the 17th century turned into the community of the whole Atlantic world, and controlled all the other communities around. So they took the importance more or less from Venice, and it shifted to Amsterdam. So the first community was founded around the turn of the century. Afterwards, two other communities were joined the first community, and in 1639, the three were united under the name of Talmud Torah, which became then the important community of Portuguese Amsterdam. So Menashe was educated by Isaac Uziel, a rabbi whom they had brought from Morocco. We need to keep in mind that the Amsterdam community was mostly founded by so-called new Jews, by Jews who had grown up in a Christian context, so they needed to bring their rabbis from somewhere else to bring their new members, their new community members, to halachic observance they were not familiar with. And later he was educated by Joseph Pardo in the community of Bet Yaakov and his successor Shaul Levi Motera. After Uziel's death in 1622, Menashe replaced him as a rabbi of the community Neve Shalom, and this is where he stayed until the unification of the three communities, as I already said, in 1639. So in 1639, he became one of the four rabbis of the unified community. So he seemed to be like a shooting star. He seemed to be something like a shooting star from the communities.
Like a protege. It was like a
protege, yes.
Yeah.
And yet his relation was always a bit difficult. So he always complained about the salary and then the economic situation. I mean, the family couldn't bring money from the Iberian Peninsula. Obviously, they had lost all their properties to the Inquisition, and also in Amsterdam, Menashe was always paid worse than his other rabbinical colleagues. So the family lived in poverty, one daughter and two sons, Joseph, who would continue Menashe's press in the 1640s, Samuel, who would join Menashe to his English enterprise, and Gracia. And to improve his economic situation, he opened actually the printing press, which became the first Jewish Hebrew printing press in Amsterdam in 1627. Where he published his first book. And he published then until 1655, he published more than 70 volumes in different languages such as Hebrew, Spanish, Portuguese, Latin, English, and Yiddish. He also printed Yiddish for Ashkenazi readers. And among these books, obviously also printed his own books in the different versions. So this is the success story, but as I said before, there is also a flip side to this success story, and this is we don't know exactly, but this is connected to problems of envy, to problems of things that the community didn't approve of. For example, there was an enormous discussion about Menashe's printing of Yosef del Medico Sefer Elim in 1629, because there were connections to Karaite positions which the community didn't approve of. So he was all the time in trouble. And this is also why he always had an eye on the Christian scholarly world. Or let's say, we don't know exactly which is the beginning and which is the consequence. But in any case, he always looked for options to become established in the Christian world or aspire positions in Christian institutions, even though he never considered converting. This is very important to say, because usually Jewish scholars would need to convert to be employed in Christian institutions. And yet Menashe, somehow, maybe he was very naive. He never considered, he always felt part of the Jewish community. He always mediated as a Jew into the Christian world, and still was in contact with people who expected him to convert and aspired to get positions, which he might, he didn't get them in the end, but even if he had got them, he would probably have had to convert. So this is an ambivalence that goes through his whole life. But it's important to say that he was not like at one step from conversion, as Christian scholars said about him all the time. So over the years, he turned, what you already said, he turned into one of the most important spokespersons for Judaism in Christian scholarly circles. And several of his books were written, in fact, in response to Christian requests. So Christians would approach him and ask him, what do the Jews, in quotation marks again, think about? And then Menashe would somehow think of an answer. And then, of course, just to finish the brief bio, in the 1650s, he began to turn his eye to England and a new spirit that he considered to be helpful for a debate about the readmission of the Jews to England. The Jews had been expelled from England since the end of the 13th century, and Menashe entered the last years of his life into negotiations with the English Parliament and Oliver Cromwell to open London for a first Portuguese community. And of course, his expectation was to become the rabbi of this first Jewish community of London, which did not come true in the end. He spent the last years of his life in London. Not very successful. He never got the written confirmation of what he wanted to get. And in 1656, after the death of his son Samuel, who had been with him, he traveled back to Holland and died on his way to Amsterdam in Middelburg, and is now buried at the Jewish cemetery in Ouderkerk.
So there's a lot there, and there's, of course, a lot more on Menashe, a lot more to say. And as you say, people can still read. I think I mentioned this in one of the Montezinos episodes. His what he wrote to Cromwell, to His Highness the Lord Protector, I think. You can read in English, it's on Hebrew books. I can put a link to that in the show's notes. There's biographies of him. Cecil Roth wrote. I mentioned Nadler, about the printing press, which is a lot to say about. Recently, David Sklar has been on the podcast before. A friend, he wrote I want to make mention of his Cultivating Education and Piety, Menashe ben Israel, lay readership, and the printing of the Mishnah in the 17th century, and a new volume called the Mishnaic Moment, very interesting about the printing of the Mishnah. Menashe, and there's a lot more. Like I said, Nishmas Chaim is still around. Mikve Yisrael we'll get to the different translations. There is Hebrew ones, Ivrit, old Hebrew, like I say, there's the English translation. That's what we're gonna focus on. But like I said, the Jews did get, I don't know if you mentioned, they did get readmitted to England after him. He never got that, but how much did he have to play in it? They did later on get readmitted to England. And then there's also the Conciliador. I'm not sure if we mentioned that, where he tried to answer up contradictions in Tanakh. And there is an English translation, also old, the volume. It's not in print, but a very interesting work for anyone interested in reading it. Okay, so that is kind of the
brief bio, and I think you mentioned, as we'll talk about this more, his contacts, his connections with various intellectuals and Christians, and this is something that he was always very involved with. And that I think we can pick up on that a little, and on Mikve Yisrael as we segue into Mikve Yisrael, and kind of how he began this interest into, as listeners already know, we can just discuss some Montezinos, Relacion, where Montezinos finds these kind of not the Native Americans, but some other natives, so to speak, that are from the tribe of Ruvain in South America. And Menashe relates this story, and then he kind of takes up where are the lost tribes, and it's a fantastical tale of the various opinions. Where are they? Where the Sambatyon River? How could they be the Native Americans? He goes through their different rituals and how they can't be Jews, they are Jews, idol worship. I mean, he goes through just the really, and all the geographical and political and historical and all kinds of philosophies of the day in this small book. So I said a lot there. Let's talk about Menashe's context connections with the intellectuals and how he got into this, how he became interested. Suddenly pivoted from publishing kind of standard books and other things, and suddenly he's interested in kind of lost tribes and that kind of thing.
I didn't get it was interrupted for a second, so I didn't get the main part of your question, sorry.
No problem. The question was, so how do we, Menashe, how did he become interested? Was it due to his connections and his contacts, if you want to talk more about them, with the intellectuals and Christians, the various famous, philosophers of his day? How did he become interested in this lost tribes and suddenly become very interested in this topic?
Okay, thank you. So as so often in the case of Menashe, his interest was first inspired by Christian discussions about the indigenous population in the Americas. This was an enormous topic after the so-called discovery of the New World, and the need to position the newly found populations of the Americas in the context of biblical genealogy and anthropology. And actually, this was much more than a scholarly dispute. If all human beings descended from Adam, and if the Bible covered all human genealogies, there needed to be a people in biblical anthropology from whom the American indigenous peoples, the American Indians, that the threat was a threat that connected Judaism and Christianity all together. And you see this very well when it comes to Isaac Laperea's Pre-Adamite. So Isaac Laperea was a French scholar, and he had a manuscript, it was not published for good reason, on human beings before Adam, supporting a view that biblical history is only one part of human history, and there are other genealogies which are outside the Bible. And this was, of course, something that neither Jews nor Christians could accept. So this was a very typical area where Menashe became involved. He often became involved in discussions that were actually that threatened Jewish thought and Christian thought alike, and where he thought we should be together, we should stand up together in terms of an Abramite theology, what he coins in several of his works, to fight against these positions that don't help any of us. So one of these discussions was connected, as I said, to the biblical origin of the so-called American Indians. And there were enormous publications in the Iberian world, in the English world, in the Netherlands, that touched up on the topic and discussed which biblical genealogy would be adequate for the people found in the Americas. So just to give you a few names, the Jesuit José de Acosta, the Dominican Gregorio Garcia, the Franciscan Juan de Torquemada, the English Richard Hakluyt, Samuel Purchas, the Traveler, and many others discussed about this topic. And some of these authors connected the discussion about the anthropology of the American Indians with the topic of the lost tribes. And this is where Menashe gets into the discussion. So this is actually where the discussion about anthropology also gets a millenarian messianistic turn. So let me very briefly say a word about millenarianism, and then I go to Montezinos and the Lost Tribes and the Mikve Yisrael. What is millenarianism? Much too difficult to explain in a few words, but just very briefly, millenarianism is a Christian eschatological expectation that Jesus will physically return to earth and that he will reign in peace for a span of 1,000 years before the last judgment. So the important thing is there will be a physical return of a second coming, as it's said, of the Messiah back to earth. And this is based on Revelation, on the last book of the Christian New Testament, where this 1,000-year reign of peace is announced, connected to the binding of Satan and the domestication of the bad of the world. Millenarianism, this is also important to say, is not part of the doctrine of any of the main established Christian churches in early modern times. But it has always been revived by apocalyptic movements in the history of the church and combined actually with eschatologies that were connected to Daniel 2 and 7 and to the question of the 4 and the 5 monarchies, which are also very prominent in this kind of speculation about the end of the days. So millenarianism actually is very strong in 17th century Amsterdam and London, and especially in England due to the political revolts of the time, to civil war and the Puritan revolt. So Calvinist thought in general has a very strong identification with Israel. So Calvinists feel very much that they are the followers of they are the true Israel in quotation marks, and they are very strongly connected to Old Testament prophecies. So this is also connected to a very very special Christian denomination, namely Calvinism Reformed theology, which is present in the Netherlands and in England. So not surprisingly, or maybe yes, surprisingly, but this is very interesting, millenarianism has quite a few connection points with Jewish messianism. So Richard Popkin has worked about this a lot, the connection between Jewish messianism and Christian millenarianism. Obviously, as there was a physical return or a physical coming of the Messiah, and people expected a 1,000-year reign on earth, there was a certain attitude among some Christian scholars and some rabbis to leave the differences aside for a while and just wait together and think about the prophecies together and see the signs together and interpret them together, with the perspective that when the Messiah comes, we'll solve the rest of the problems, which are concerned to the past and which concern the essence of the Messiah, obviously, which is totally different in Judaism and Christianity. But still, people waited together and they exchanged their interpretations of the prophecies together. So Menashe was very strongly involved in these millenarian expectations. In the Netherlands, he was in the circle of Petrus Serrarius in the Netherlands. He was in the circle of millenarians in England, Paul Felgenhauer in the Netherlands. In England, the circles of John Dury and Samuel Helpdeep, about whom we'll speak in a second. And all these expectations and this waiting together with the expectation that the lost tribes might be found. I mean, this is one essential part of the prophecies concerning the end of the days, that Jews need to be spread all over the earth and need to be reassembled from all over the earth when the Messiah comes. So one important topic was, of course, which were the places where Jews were not yet present. And one of these places was the American continent until then. So the report of Montezinos and the idea that Jews might be already in the Americas seemed to be like only one more step towards the end of the day. And this was, of course, celebrated by Jews and Christians alike as a way to the millennium. So, or the Messianic times in the Jewish context, of course. So Montezinos, you already had a session on it. I won't say much about it, but he was a Jewish traveler in the Americas, in the Andes, between today's Colombia and Ecuador. And he claimed that he had, through an indigenous mediator, been in touch with one of the lost tribes, living behind a river in Colombia, Ecuador, where nobody was supposed to cross. And that actually this is where the hidden Jews of the Americas lived secretly until the Messiah came, and until they would be able to return. So as soon as rumors about Montezinos' report, Montezinos came to Amsterdam. He stayed in Amsterdam, and he spoke about his encounter with the tribe of Reuben in the Andes. So as soon as Christians heard about this report, they approached Menashe and asked him what the Amsterdam Jews thought about it. So Menashe was always this kind of, what do the Jews think about? And in this case, the same thing. He was approached to answer what the Jews think about the report everybody had heard about. And the person, I mean, there were several persons who approached Menashe, but the most important was certainly John Dury, who was a prominent and very important scholar working all his time for a reunion of the churches, the Christian churches. So he was involved in educational projects and religious projects, working towards the unification of the split of Western Christianity. And he wrote Menashe asking him about his position, and Menashe answered Dury actually in a letter in 1648 that was afterwards printed in Thomas Thorogood's Jews in America from 1650, which was a book that was dedicated to a justification of the Puritan mission in Massachusetts in North America. But still, Dury reprinted in an apostolical discourse that was appended, or that was actually put as a introduction to Thorogood's work. He explained that he had been in touch with Menashe, and he paraphrased Menashe's wordings and explanations about Montezinos and the lost tribes. And Menashe also answered that he would touch upon the topic in a monograph afterwards, and this was the beginning and the birth of Mikve Yisrael. But in this case, so this was very, very normal for Menashe, what he did, that he answered Christian approaches, but still in this case, he did something a bit different, because he turned the book into a Jewish book in the end, in fact. So it was not anymore, it started as a book on biblical anthropology and the problems of the Spanish scholars in terms of the indigenous, the roots of the indigenous peoples in the Americas. But in the end, it turned into the book about the Messiah that Menashe announced early on in his life that he wanted to write, but that he never wrote actually, because Menashe avoided topics which were at the center of Jewish-Christian polemics, and the Messiah was, of course, a difficult topic for somebody who didn't want to get into trouble with his Christian partners. So yes, Mikve Yisrael was the long version of this short answer to John Dury, and written in different languages. We'll certainly speak about this.
Yeah, well, we'll get into the Mikve Yisrael, the book itself, in a few minutes. But that was a very, I think, nice introduction there. A couple of things. So first of all, as you mentioned, this kind of expectation to have the Jews everywhere in the world, I think that's kind of what leads later on to Menashe trying to get the Jews readmitted to England and his, trip to Cromwell. But that's after this. So maybe we can discuss this at the end. In general, discussing the Millenerianism and the various Christians and the American Indians, the indigenous people, that and the kind of hypothesis that those were Jews and the lost tribes of Israel. So I'll make mention already now that the plan is to have another episode about this with Professor Elizabeth Fenton, who wrote a recent book called Old Canaan and a New World, dedicated, basically about this, literally about that topic. And there's a lot to say there where, you outlined some of it already. And you mentioned Dury and Thorogood and Montezinos. They first have the Relation in there as sent by Menashe in French, but we have it in his book in Mikve Yisrael. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Mikve Yisrael and what Menashe does in the work. As you mentioned, the translations, I think it's written in Spanish, Portuguese, Latin. If you talk a little bit about that, and it translates to English fairly quickly. I'll mention that already here. The English edition that we have from Lippmann today is actually still using the 1652 translation by Moses Wall. I think there's a little about Moses Wall in the back. There's an appendix by Richard Popkin, who you mentioned, and their notes are by, going to mess up the French names, Henry Michouland, if I mentioned it, and Gerard Nahon. So that they have notes and a very nice introduction, and they edited it. But the actual English translation in the Mikve Yisrael that we have today is this old one. There's also a standard Hebrew one today. You can talk more about the translation. I just want to mention it once we're talking about it here. There's you can definitely print one off Hebrew books from Vilna. I'll put in the show's notes. People can check. It's a few dollars. You can print it. Then there's also, I have from I think it's Nachum Dorman has a book on Menashe ben Israel in Ivrit, and he has a translation there with footnotes. And we can talk about it, especially where those translations came from, because that's something, especially with the English one. Okay, but I just wanted to mention that, and I'll put them in the show's notes, and listeners can check it out. Let's get back to the book itself. So Menashe writes this, as you say, it's his long response. I mean, you could say what languages he wrote it in originally, and let's talk a little bit more about it.
So actually, Menashe wrote two versions. He wrote a Latin version and he wrote a Spanish version. The book was not written in Portuguese. It was translated into English quite quickly by Moses Wall, but not by Menashe. I mean, this is Menashe's English. This is a point of discussion, how strong it really was or not. And the Hebrew translation is also much later. It's the end of the 17th century. Also published in Amsterdam, but after the death of Menashe. And then there is a Dutch translation in 1666, which is an important year in terms of Sabbatianism. So this is certainly no accident. But the two versions that I'm concerned with, or the three versions, are the Latin and the Spanish version, because these are the versions that Menashe really worked on, and that really have his hand in them, in the changes. So the Spanish version, to begin with, is divided into three parts. It begins with Montezinos' report. Now in a Spanish version, he had sent a French version to Dury, as you said before, and this is now the Spanish version. And then somehow Menashe first gives a summary of the state of research. This is how we would call it today, concerning the origin of the American Indians. Of course, I mean, just to make it clear, American Indians is politically not correct, but this is the term that's used. The indigenous people of the Americas. And then he comes to a survey of the places in the world where Jews dwell. connected to the question of the dispersal of the Jews all over the world that we've already spoken about. And then he ends with a discussion about the prophecies concerning the coming of the Messiah and the gathering of the Jews as announced in the book of Josiah. So actually, the third part particular is about the sufferings of the Jews around the world, the intention to prove that the prophecies, the prophecies in terms of sufferings have come true, and that the expectations in terms of happiness will also come true, because one part is already fulfilled and the other part is just to be expected. And this part is actually the messianic treatise that Menashe always wanted to write and that he didn't write. So Menashe's dictum on the lost tribes, his position about the lost tribes, is mostly in the first part, and it's very clear and very he's very quick with it. There's not so much discussion about it. First of all, the Spanish are wrong who want the American Indians to be Jews. So he's very strict. He's a bit less strict in his Latin version, but the Spanish version is they are completely wrong. And I mean, this is the position of a 17th century European person. Obviously, the American Indians cannot be Jews because because due to their idolatry, their lack of civilization, and everything that does not connect them to the, in quotation marks, high civilization of Judaism. So he speaks about idolatras y de tan bárbaras costumbres. They have barbaric customs, the indigenous people. I mean, he's very much a person of his time, of course. So Jews, and then, of course, there is a problem, but because he does want Jews to be the first to populate the Americas. So how does he bring these different perspectives together? So what he says is that Jews had been the first to come to the American continent, and this is, of course, against the Spaniards who claimed this for themselves. But afterwards, they had been dispelled by Tartar peoples who had come over from India to the Americas before the Spanish and the Portuguese came even. And the American Indians are descendants of these Tartar peoples. So there had been a war between the Jews, the very first Jews in the Americas, and these people from Tartar. And during this war, the Jews had been defeated, or they had been exiled. So this was something that was already in Montezinos, because already in the report of Montezinos, Francisco, the mediator, the indigenous mediator, spoke about a war between the Jews, the tribe of Reuben that they had found, and his people, and that they had been defeated and that they had been expelled, but that obviously now they had somehow grown together and were waiting for the messianic moment to take revenge on the Spanish, who had done so much harm to the two of them, and then turn history into messianic history, into something different. So actually, Menashe never claims that what Popkin has called the Jewish Indian theory is correct. He never claims that the Jews are that the Jews are the origins of the indigenous people in the New World. He does claim that the Jews are the first in the Americas, but then others come in between and change the order of world history. And so he combines somehow, it's a very tricky way of combining all the different positions that he wishes to combine. And actually, many others, not myself, have emphasized that Menashe has been misread by his Christian readers who wanted to confirm the Jewish Indian theory, and that a jury, among others, wrote that he is a good point, a Jewish voice to support the Jewish Indian theory. But in fact, Menashe didn't do. So they also read what they wanted to read and didn't read what they did not want to read, as always, also in the other books of Menashe.
Yeah, you discussed that in your the chapter in your book about Mikve Yisrael, and I'll just some parts of this book. Like I said, it's really a fascinating read, even though the translation is a bit archaic in the current English, but it's still a good read, and the notes are good, the introduction is great. I would recommend to anyone to read it if you want to read something really interesting. And as you talk about it, he compares the Native Americans and whatever indigenous population of the islands to, again, North America, South America, and he compares them, are they Jews or not? He goes through this theory that they are the lost tribes of Israel. And like I said, he's a person of his time in the 17th century. It's really interesting to read that he says they were white and bearded. He talks about verses they were, as the original translation, that the Indians are of brown color and without beards. And then he goes through, he compares, it's really interesting to read where he compares the laws and customs of Indians and Hebrews together and finding them agreeing, and talking about the Indians of Yucatan and of somewhere else circumcise themselves, the Totans of New Spain and the Mexicans rend their garments if there's happened any sudden misfortune or death. Says the Mexican and the Totans and other places, they keep fire continually upon their altars, God commanded in Leviticus. Those of Peru, the temples of the sun. But then he talks about idolatry as well. So it's very interesting just to read him comparing, and the notes are good. It's really interesting to talk about. Some of them get divorced. The Indians, Peru, New Spain, and Guatemala did marry the widows of their dead brethren. And he says, may you not judge from these things that the Jews lived in those places and the Gentiles learned such things from them. So again, he's busy with that they learned it from them, not that they are them. And that's what Montezinos and his Relacion, which Menashe includes, is busy with as well, that the lost tribe of Reuben was somewhere, far away, but it wasn't the Native American population. And Menashe as well gets into, so if the lost tribe of Israel, but if they were in the Americas altogether, how did they get there? Right, and he talks about how they traveled. How did they get all the way from Israel to the Americas? So that's something really interesting that he talks about. Again, it's just really interesting. Like I said, a little bit fantastical to read all these theories and various things. So okay, so now as you say, the Christian, you talk about this, they kind of misinterpreted Menashe and they kind of ran with it another way. But what else is there to say about what he has to say, like about the lost tribes and about he has to say about Sambatun River? I mean, he does talk about this as well, but like you're saying, he also gets into the Messiah, Mashiach, and Messianism as well. It's not only, the book is not completely only about lost tribes and Native American theory.
So no, I was just wondering. Yes, actually, the last part of the book is interesting because he uses this last part to really plant before his reader the whole panorama of Jewish existence in the world. Of course, he also needs the Jews to be in the Americas because afterwards he will claim that they need to be in England too, as you already said. But this book is also important in terms of not so much discussing the Messianic times. He will do this a bit later in his Even Yekara, in his last book. But in terms of describing the situation of the Jewish communities on the earth, on their the sufferings, the victims of the Inquisition, the whole pressure, pogroms, but also the support that they have from Christians, and giving the panorama of the times like before the Messiah, and how far the earth is prepared and what should be done to I'm not sure. I mean, there's a lot of discussion how much Menashe is really involved in strong messianic thinking. So political, Isma Shosh has called this to realpolitik, so his turn, where he really uses the topic that is given to him to discuss the political situation and turn the millenarian expectations of his Christian correspondents actually into a situation that might be helpful to improve the situation of the Jews, and at the same time also speak to his Jewish audience and keep them away from Christian millenarianism, which is obviously also a bit delicate in a community of new Jews with a Christian background.
I'll just jump back to Mikve Yisrael again. Section 15, where it starts talking about the lost tribes. I will just make mention. I have it in front of me now. I found it. So he says, interestingly, you must know that all the 10 tribes were not carried away at the same time. And he goes through this, section 16. The 10 tribes being conquered at several times, we must think they were carried into several places. And he goes through the various different places that they were. He goes into Matteo Ricci, and he talks about how they were in China, and they're in this place, and they're in that place. And there's a lot to read here. I'm not going to read the whole the different Jesuits and different reports of where they are. Even goes back to the Greeks, including Ptolemy. He says, then he goes to various other places. I'm just trying to jump around over here to see what he says. There's a lot here. I don't want to, in all different places. He goes into Eldad Hadani, listeners are familiar with. He talks about Shlomo Molcho, talks about David Roveni. He goes through living in Ethiopia, Prester John. Basically, Menashe is trying to say, essentially, is that they're not all in one place. Might be in some have this, again, in this series, there were some various people throughout history have the conception that the lost tribes are in one place. Menashe is saying, no, they're all over. Here are all these reports. Here's all what happened. They're all over the place. They're everywhere. And then in section 20, he goes through the Sambatyon. And he says, lastly, all think that part of the 10 tribes dwell beyond the river Sambatyon, or sabbatical. He brings Rabbi Yochanan, he brings more in Sanhedrin, that the 10 tribes were carried to 3 places. Sabbatical River, to Daphne, the suburbs of Antioch, and thither, you can see the old-fashioned translation here, and thither where a cloud comes down and covers them. And that they shall be redeemed from these 3 places. He goes through Menashe and Uziel. I mean, it's British right, one of them Midrashim. So there is a lot over here. Brings Josephus, obviously, he's bringing Rashi, sorry, it says here, Shlomo Yarchi, and this is Rashi. It's interesting I will say, I wish there was a newer English translation, because sometimes it does get a bit archaic, but you could read. It goes through Abraham Farisol, Yosef HaKohen, Kohen from Emer Kabacha. But again, there's just, it's a lot here, and I think someone reading it today will come across with this kind of fantastical notion. It's a bit out there, I think, to read this. That's kind of my impression. Maybe others would have a different impression of it. And something else here to kind of cross-reference and connect this work, I think, with the other series that I did last year on Shabbos Tzvi. Shabbos Tzvi appears later on. This book is written some 16 years or so before. Shabbos Tzvi is 1665, 66. This is written, correct me, around
1650.
Yeah, 1650. So is this kind of the precursor? What does this lead to? This kind of interest in the Native Americans and bringing all the tribes together. Menashe goes to England, and there's this kind of messianic hope. I mean, does this kind of lead to the messianic discourse? Because as listeners know from that series, Amsterdam is like a hotbed of Sabbatianism after this and belief in Shabbos Tzvi. What kind of an impact does this work have on Sabbatianism?
This is what I already said. Actually, it was translated into Dutch in 1666, so at the high time of Sabbatianism. And yes, so people who have studied Sabbatianism, what I haven't done, I have to confess, say that this was a prime work for the spread of Sabbatianism, actually, due to the stories and the prophecies and the expectations and everything that, and also what you already said. I mean, the correspondence as Jews haven't been, the lost tribes haven't been expelled once at a time. It was a slow process of different expulsions. So they also need to be reassembled in different times from all the points of the earth, and going through actually all these different regions. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about a little bit more about, I don't know if you want to mention any more of Menashe's conclusions and the conclusions of the book. Let's first talk about that as conclusions of the work, and then kind of where it goes from there. You already mentioned the expedition to Cromwell and to England, but if you want to just, get back to it here and say Menashe's conclusions, and then, is that true? Does that kind of lead him straight on to his mission to England?
There are discussions about this, how much this goes directed to the mission to England. I would say Actually, I don't read usually the Mikve Yisrael is read in a series of the English works of Menashe. So it's connected to the humble addresses and it's connected to the Vidikya Judaeorum. I tend to read it in a long series of Menashe's other publications, also where he interacts with Christian scholars. So as I said, I see this work as a response to the Christian problem of biblical anthropology, which Menashe actually employs to scholarly Republic of Letters. And with this, maybe earn himself an important position in political negotiations afterwards. This is what I said when I hinted at the question of the public intellectual in the beginning. So he is a scholar, but he uses his knowledge, his cultural capital, if you want so, in terms of Bourdieu, to establish himself in Christian circles, thinking that once he would be established, he would have a voice, which does not come true. He's too early with his position. But it's very easy to read the Mikve not as the first book of his English books, but like a book at the height of his discussions with Christian partners. And the interesting thing I would say, and the conclusion of this is that usually he answers Christian questions as they are giving him, and somehow has to make his way through problems that are not always really Jewish problems. But in this case, he turns it into really a book about the messianic expectations. He turns it into a book about the condition of the Jews in his times, in pre-messianic times, and the signs that are visible of things coming. And he also says in his letter to Dury that this is a book about the Inquisition. And actually, he does use the platform of this book, as he does in other books, to write about the Inquisition, to write about the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula, to write about the sufferings of Jewish martyrs in the Americas, in Iberian lands, and to like put all his emotions into this history of the condition of the Jews, that his nation, especially the Sephardic Jews, but also Ashkenazi Jews in his time. So I would say, in terms of conclusion, the first conclusion is, of course, that he defeats the Spanish challenge of being the first nation to discover, in quotation marks, the Americas. Then he has to struggle with the in-between. Jews were in the Americas, but they are not the ancestors of the indigenous population. And then he uses this book to write a book about the Messiah, about the prophecies about the Messiah, and really encourage the Jews of his time to hope for a better situation, without offending his Christian readers in a subject so delicate as the Messiah. So he avoids questions that would go to the heart of Jewish-Christian controversy, as he always does in his books, and still touches upon the topic.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the languages. I think we touched on this, but I think it's important to emphasize here. So, as you mentioned, what it was written in. So, the English translation we have now is written in 52. You mentioned that was written originally in Latin and Spanish, but the English translation from 52, like I said, Popkin has a little appendix there about this Moses Wall and who he was. That English translation was what came from where? How accurate is that? And what do you have to say about the new edition that was edited? The one published by Littman, where they did edit slightly, trying to fix any corrections in the text.
So the English translation is actually a translation of the Latin version, and I mean, this is a very clear pattern in Menashe's work. So he writes in Spanish to his Portuguese Jewish readers, converso readers, and he writes in Latin when he addresses the Christian Republic of Letters. So they're very there are very clear differences, but in all cases, I mean, we have two versions of Menashe's books on the resurrection. We have two versions on Menashe's books on human fragility. And we also have two versions on the Mikve Yisrael. And so they're very typical differences. Like the Spanish versions are always a bit more popular. They go more into anecdotes. They need more explanation because they are not necessarily written for scholars and for well-educated people. They are for merchants, for converts, for people who come from a different context. The Latin versions are written for scholars, Christian Hebraists, and usually they have more sources, more quotation, Hebrew quotations, whereas the Spanish versions usually translate Hebrew because not all conversos were very fluent in Hebrew when they came to Amsterdam. So these are very typical differences. But then we have also differences, and this is also true for the Mikve Yisrael. This is why I just mentioned it. But this is a very general pattern to repeat it in all of Menashe's works, which are published in two versions. And then we have also several comments that might not, which might offend Christian readers or which are too strong for Christian readers, that he smoothens a bit, or that he takes out, or he would also be a bit more delicate in his formulations in the Latin version. So, Benjamin Broad has written on this, that when he speaks about the Spanish theory about the Jewish Indians, that in the Spanish version he says this is complete nonsense, and in the Latin version he says, well, there are some different positions and there's things that one could disagree about. So he's much more, he's very sensitive, in fact, to what his readers still support and what they don't support anymore. And also in terms of, I studied this in my book, I found this very fascinating, what you mentioned, the report about Jews in China. And I love this passage because it's taken from Nicolas Trigault, who has written a report on Matteo Ricci and his encounter, the Jesuit Matteo Ricci and his encounter with a Jew in China. And the whole report is full of misunderstandings. So everything that the Jesuit reads in Christian terms, the Jew reads in Jewish terms. But as Trigault also said, the Jew doesn't know that he's a Jew. So he speaks about Israel, but somehow he doesn't know how to put himself in this whole, and everybody thinks that the other's on the same side, but in the end they are not. And the whole story is a story of misunderstandings. So I took this as a motto for my book because I think that Menashe very much identified with this passage in his negotiation with Christians. And the whole story of misunderstandings, interestingly, is fully translated into the Spanish version of Menashe's book. So he really translates from Trigault, from the Latin version, and I didn't find a Spanish translation which is the same as Menashe's. So I suppose that he really translated it. But when it comes to the Latin text, which he could have taken from Trigault, just the original, he does not. He retranslates it into Latin. And very interesting, he leaves out all the comments that have to do with cultural misunderstandings and though each one speaking about one thing, but nobody understanding the other. So he just doesn't want to speak about this with his Christian public, but it's very present in his Spanish work. And this is a very particular place, but I think it's symptomatic for what Menashe thinks, and I also think it's a very personal way of dealing with his own problems. But we have several of these quotations when it comes, as I said, to the first discovery of the America in relation to Jewish Christian encounters after the Messiah. So what will happen in the fifth monarchy? There Menashe is also much more direct in his Spanish account than in his Latin account, because this is the monarchy of Israel due to him, and this will be the monarchy. What he builds up on this in his Even Yekara, in his later work. Actually, there are differences in the texts that are, I think, that are very conscious. They are not. This is what what some scholars say, that these differences go back to just translation ills and problems, but I think they are very conscious, and I think this is part of Menashe's whole program. And as it can be seen in other books too, I think this is no accident, and it also shows that Menashe did translate his books. And actually, the Spanish version of the Esperanza de Israel, as the book is called, is translated in the Michelin edition into French. So there you have the full Spanish text to be compared with the Latin text, which is the basis for the English translation.
Okay, and like I said, I'll put a link to the English, and I'll put a link to the Hebrew from Hebrew books. You can print it out for a few dollars. The old Hebrew, not Dorman's Ivrit. I don't think that's not available now. I don't think we mentioned also where he goes through the Messianism and he goes through Mashiach. He married an Abarbanel, descendant of the great Abarbanel. So in Abarbanel has a famous 3-volume Messianic trilogy. So this is something that he was interested in, and he felt connected. He was related. So he does go through, he discusses the Abarbanel, and this is something that's discussed at length over there, which we didn't, we mentioned, but we didn't get fully into. And for purposes of this series, it's because of the interest in the lost tribes and the Native Americans and the Sambatian and going through Chazal and Midrashim. It's, again, I don't know if we, not doing it into justice, if we brought out enough actual examples, but you really have to read it. Like I said, the English is a little archaic, but it's a really good read, and anyone interested in this topic really should read it. So that's with that. Now, what about just as we finalize? So I will put a link to your book as well. It is a bit pricey. I will mention in the English, but
Very sorry, I would have preferred another edition, but this is what I have.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm not saying it on you. I just want the listeners to know, if they're looking into the book and they're like, "Oh my goodness, it's expensive." That's what it is. What other reading is there for those interested in Menashe, and especially on the on lost tribes? If Menashe's connection about Mikve Yisrael, essentially.
I mean, you already mentioned on the different. There are 4 monographs on Menashe by now. You already mentioned Stephen Nadler, which is the most recent one, which is a biographical sketch. Very readable, very, very, very well written. Then you have my book, which is focused on the Jewish-Christian interactions, actually. So I study all the Christian reception of Menashe, the Christian misreadings, position it in the context of also the ambivalences in his own community and the reactions, trying to show that actually he played with fire many times, trying to make his way into Christian society, but also to help his Jewish co-religionists, but didn't really recognize the points where he should change or step back. So a very delicate tightrope walk, but still until the Mikve probably very successful, and afterwards unfortunately failing. So this is my book. Then we have Lionel Ifra, 2001, L'Aigle d'Amsterdam. This is a French book on Menashe, which is very much focused on the England. Most of the books, I mean, this was one of my reasons to turn to Menashe, that I saw that most of the works that we have on him are on his negotiations with Cromwell, and only seen in this light. So the Latin and the Spanish texts are not very well, or were not very well studied. And I think there is still a lot to say about them. And then we have, of course, Cecil Roth, and going back in time, a classical biography from 1934, Menashe ben Israel, rabbi, printer, and diplomat. So these are the volumes on Menashe right now. Then we have several of Menashe's works that have been translated into French, Hebrew, or English. You already mentioned the English translation of the Conciliador. We have wonderful French translations by Michelin now. We have already spoken about them, with lengthy introductions which go very deeply into the topic. So there is a lot in French. Not everybody reads French, but there's a lot that you can read about. There are still many works of Menashe that haven't been translated and that are still waiting for their translation, especially the Latin ones. So Michelin also concentrates on the Spanish versions, and there is still a lot to be said about the Latin books of Menashe. Also, I mean, Menashe has books that have only been published in Latin, and there we don't have any references to. And then, of course, Nishmat Chaim, which is his only Hebrew book, which should definitely be translated into English, and still waits for a longer study. This is for sure. And finally, we have a lot of works on the context of Menashe. So we have the wonderful contributions of Kaplan, Joseph Kaplan, to the Portuguese Jews in the 17th century. I mean, the pioneering works that he did. We have the monographs of Daniel Schwedzinski and Miriam Bodian on Amsterdam in the 17th century. We have on the readmission of the Jews to England, David Katz and also Lionel Ifra, again in French. And we have the Montezinos books. So there is a lot of work around Menashe and a lot to read and many readable works, really, I think.
Yeah, I'll link some of those in the show's notes. I also mentioned Sklar's recent article. Also, that Katz and the readmission is a different one, not the Rabbi, the podcast one, the Jewish podcast of Rabbi Dr. David Katz. Nishmas Chaim, as you mentioned, even the Hebrew edition really needs to be done in a proper Hebrew edition. The one around now just has nikudas. It wasn't not critical at all. It has the picture on the cover, the purported picture by Rembrandt of Menashe. What was Menashe's relationship with Rembrandt? Nadler gets into that, because Rembrandt definitely did some work in some of Menashe's books.
But this is Eben Yekara. This is not Nishmat Chaim, the Rembrandt. Yeah.
Right, I know that. But what I'm saying was the Nishmas Chaim, the Hebrew edition today, the cover they put the picture that purportedly Menashe by Rembrandt. Yeah, that there was a relationship. But Nadler in his book goes into in the podcast I did with him discusses Rembrandt. I'll also link to the. It was a while ago, but I'll link to the 2 years ago, not a while ago. But I'll link to the podcast I did with Nadler. It's on the site, but I'll put it in the show's notes for those interested can listen to that as well. More of a broad view of Menashe. So, okay, hopefully this was, like I said, informative. And, like I said, I really don't think we mentioned enough examples from the book. I only say that because there's so much there to read. And we more mentioned in general, we went through it. But the specifics of what he discusses is very interesting, and it's well worth the read. And especially for those.
And it's a short book. It's not very long.
Yeah, we should emphasize that. So in the book, in the in the English edition, so from the Littman Library, starting with, I'll just go to the beginning, when it starts, the dedication, which is on, I'm looking right now, I'll just start from there. The dedication is on page 99, and the book, where there are footnotes and no endnotes, with the footnotes, the book goes until page 164. So it's about 65 pages with footnotes. I mean, without footnotes, it's probably a 30-page book. It's a very small book, and you can get through it very, very quickly if you're interested in reading it. It's broken down into sections. You can get through it in one sitting, a few hours probably. I mean, some of it, is heavy reading, but it's a again, the issue being the English is a bit old-fashioned, but it's not terrible. It's not like impossible to read. So,
but it's also difficult. I mean, in terms of what do you do with 3 books, 3 versions? Which one do you translate? If you make one translation and then footnotes for every difference, then it's also not anymore readable. So, I mean, the dedications are different. The English work has a dedication that is already somehow directed towards England, which is written with jury, which is, of course, not in the Spanish version. So I think it's the easiest way to just take the English version, but I don't know how to edit appropriately these works that are multilingual, and how to bring them together and compare them, actually, which is needed to understand the background of the book.
Absolutely. Okay, so I will link to a whole bunch of that stuff, and again, just that was the emphasis. If you're interested, read the book, because it will do much more justice than Oh, you did a great job, Professor Rauschenbach. I want to thank you, but what I mean by much, more just, you'll really get the real feel of the book by reading it and going through it and seeing, what he says. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.